So I'm back. Can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yes, sir. We can hear you. We can see your screen as well.
Okay. So sorry for wasting this time, but I keep forgetting that the Apple computers are a bit finicky about sharing stuff. So I need to authorize screen sharing every time I log in into a new platform. So what I'm going to try and do is to take you through writing a paper, and the essence of writing a paper is understanding the IMRAD structure of an original article. Now, most articles that we write could actually, irrespective of the kind of article that we write, could be written using the IMRAD structure. But typically, the IMRAD structure is used for an original research paper. So let's see what one does when we have to write a paper. The first thing that one needs to do is that before we start writing, we need to ask ourselves a few questions. Put pen on paper, and today, before you strike the first keystrokes on your computer, ask yourself, do I have anything to say? And if I have anything to say, is it worth saying? Has it already been said by 500 different people? And if it has been said by 500 different people, how am I going to be different from anybody else? If the answer to my first two questions, do I have anything to say and is it worth saying, is yes, then what is the right format? And there could be multiple ways in which I could present my original research data. It could be in the form of a full-length original article, but if I don't have enough material, it could be a brief report or even a letter to the editor. And what we need to do is to look at a paper and look at whether it's good. A lot of people ask me, what is a good paper? And it's very difficult to say what is good. What is good for you may not be good for somebody else. But generally for me, what is a good paper is a paper which has good content, a structure. It's complete in all its parts, and there are numerous parts to an original paper, or even for that matter, a review article, an editorial, or any other kind of paper. And finally, it must have a message. If it doesn't have a message, then it's incomplete. And it's incomplete, then it's not good. So these are the four elements that need to be present in a good paper. So just as any other write-up, anything else that you write, something that we wrote when we were students in school, in our language classes, we wrote up essays. We had something which had a beginning, and we had something which had an end. And then there was a main body in between. Very similar to this, very akin to this, is an original research paper. It has a beginning, which is called the introduction, and it has an end, which is the discussion. But in contrast to the essay, where we could write a lot of rubbish in the middle and hope that our language teacher doesn't catch us, the middle here in a paper is extremely important. The methods and the results section. In fact, this is the heart of the paper. And that's the IMRAD structure for you: the introduction, the methods, the results, and discussion, which forms the acronym IMRAD. So Austin Bradford Hill, a gentleman who did a fair amount of work, in fact, some pioneering work on the relationship between smoking and lung cancer and the establishment of disease causations, some things that go along with his name, said whenever you write up a paper, you must ask yourself and answer 4 questions. And each of these questions corresponds to one part of the paper. So why did you start corresponds to the introduction section of the paper. What did you do corresponds to the method section of the paper. What did you find to the results section? And what does it all mean to the discussion section of the paper? So let's look at the introduction. Why did you start? And what do we write in that section of a paper? If we know what we have to write within these sections of a paper, life becomes so much easier. So we need to review the pertinent literature. just enough to orient the reader to what we are going to tell the reader in the methods and the discussion section. We need to define the lacunae in current knowledge. But to do this, we must be brief, clear, and to the point. We should not digress from what our focus is, what our aim is, and we try and achieve that by being to the point. To do all this, to review the literature, to define the lacunae, we need to provide key references to support the information that we are giving in our introduction section. It's often useful to end the introduction section with a statement such as, "We therefore decided to do this study because of this reason," and you just go ahead and give a reason for doing the study. It just focuses the attention of the reader on what exactly you wanted to do, and also gives you an opportunity to be able to crystallize your own thoughts as to what you want to project majorly from the research that you have done. Look at this introduction. This was a paper which won the Nobel Prize. Watson and Crick in Nature. Look at the page spread, 737 to 738, 2 pages? No, it's not even 2 pages. It's actually 2 columns, 2¼ columns. 1 column on one page and 1¼ column on the other page. And they started off the introduction section of their research letter, which was actually a letter to the editor, by saying these 2 sentences. "We wish to suggest a structure for the salt of deoxyribose nucleic acid, DNA. This structure has novel features which are of considerable biological importance." Note how they understate their case. They want their peers to go ahead and understand the importance of the work and not, go ahead and shout about how they've done this great piece of work. I'm sure they were aware of the fact as to how important their work was, and but they did not dance with joy and say, "We've done superlative piece of work and you must read our paper." And an effective introduction actually zooms in from a very broad perspective. So what is known and unknown at a much broader level. So while we say globally, it doesn't necessarily mean worldwide. It could mean in a very localized area, but a more broad perspective. We then narrow down to a more regional perspective, a local presentation of the issue, and finally the objectives of the study to address the issue locally. And if we do this from a broad perspective to coming down to a narrow perspective, we would then be able to focus the reader on the exact purpose of the study that we are doing. And this would lead to a very effective introduction. We then need to look at the method section. And the question that we aim to answer is, what did you do? And under the section, what did you do? What did you do? We need to say what all was done, how was it done, when was it done, and who did it? Now you may say it's not very important when was it done, but in some studies it may be very important when was the study done. When was the measurements taken? When were these the variables assessed? Was it at a time when the patient was fasting? Was it in the morning hours? Was it in the middle of the night? Was it after a certain amount of preparation, or was it an unprepared sample that was taken? And who did it? For example, if I was to measure blood pressure, it would be extremely important to know whether a person who was measuring the blood pressure was trained or not trained in measuring blood pressure. And therefore, this could be another aspect that one must provide to other people. Remember, it is the method section which is going to allow other people to be able to reproduce what you've done. And in science, it's almost never that the first paper becomes the last paper of the subject. There is usually multiple papers which will corroborate what has been done before a lot of us will change the way we treat our patients, the way we diagnose patients. And we always wait for what editors like to call as valuable confirmation of known results. We also need to tell people, how did we analyze our results? Did we just decide a statistical test a priori, or did we decide to do whatever we wanted to as we went along? In today's day and age, we need to provide ethical clearance. Did we have ethical clearance? And we need to provide evidence of the fact that we had ethical clearance, irrespective of the study being done on humans or on animals, and was informed consent taken from the patients who were involved in the study. So therefore, when we do the method section, we need to provide sufficient details. If you're doing a new method, provide all details, as much detail as possible, so that somebody else who wishes to replicate the study is able to do so. If there's a study, if there's a method that has been previously described, we could provide just a reference to that method or describe it in brief, but preferably not cite an abstract or an abstract of a conference proceedings or an obscure journal which people may not be able to access. Because if they are unable to access the paper, then it's going to be difficult for them to be able to reproduce whatever you've done. If you modify anything, please describe those modifications. Because again, without the modifications, it will be very difficult for somebody to be able to say how and what you did, and therefore be able to replicate what you've done. These are reporting guidelines. I'll show you a slide at the end where you can get these from. But for almost every kind of study, starting from a case report to a systematic review and a meta-analysis, there are standard reporting guidelines. Guidelines will tell you what you should tell people when you report your study. A consort statement is something that a lot of us are familiar with, and this is for randomized controlled trials. And this has in fact improved the quality of randomized reporting of randomized controlled trials, standardized the way in which randomized controlled trials are presented, and hence made it easy for people who read randomized trials to be able to understand them, assess them, and use them in their own practice. We then go on to the section results, and what we need to answer at what did you find. So essentially what you're looking at is providing answers to people, answers to the questions you posed. It's very important, even if you're looking at retrospective data. If you've got 40 variables or 500 patients, you must ask yourself a question. What do I want out of this data? Without a question in mind, you will never be able to get an answer. If you have multiple questions, you'll get multiple answers. And what is important is that in one paper, always try and have one question and one answer. If you have one question and you attempt to answer that one question, your paper is much more focused, much clearer, and much more easy to understand by everyone. Remember, your first reader is the editor of the journal to whom you submit the paper. But the first reader, who will most probably skim through the paper and decide whether to send it out for peer review or not. But the people who are going to be the most likely to read through the whole paper, the first people, are the set of people who are going to decide whether or not your paper should be published. And they are your peer reviewers. And hence, it's extremely important that we make sense to them. And if we were to have one question and one answer, then it's very likely that the reviewers would be able to understand what we're saying very easily. Also remember that while we've worked for years together on that paper, sometimes 3, 4, 5 years on a study and then a year writing up a paper, and therefore know everything inside out, the first people who start reading the paper have no clue of what we've done. All they've got in front of them is those few printed pages which they've got to understand. And from that, understand exactly what you've done over 3, 4, or 5 years, or sometimes over even longer periods of time. Therefore, it's extremely important that before we sit down to write, we collate our data. We prepare master tables, irrespective of how you do them. Like it on a piece of paper, make big charts, use an Excel format, do anything. But recheck the accuracy of the information available with you. Then before you analyze, you list all the findings that you have and identify the important ones. the ones which are actually relevant to answering the question that you have posed for yourself. Because without that, you will make a mess of the results section of the paper. The results are usually written using text, tables, and figures. And each one of these has its own place. So therefore, they should be used judiciously and appropriately. We get into a bad habit because we do our dissertations. We may put the same piece of information in the text, the same piece of information in the tables, and the same piece of information in figures. When you write up a paper, please don't do it. In fact, I would suggest that if you are guides and mentors of students, please ensure that your thesis does not have duplication of information. What is there in the text does not need to appear in the tables. What appears in the tables doesn't need to appear in the figures, and vice versa. Now, as we look at writing up results, we need to decide on a method of writing up the results or a sequence of writing up the results. We need to obviously provide the results of all that we've done. And if this is in the form of experiments, and these were done in a natural order or in a natural sequence, then you describe the results in a natural sequence. Now, this is easy for people who work in the laboratories because usually they move from one step to another step to a third step in the section, in the way they're doing their experiments. Unfortunately, for a lot of us who are clinicians, that doesn't happen. So we do things simultaneously. And therefore, we could either put them in a logical sequence or describe them in the same sequence as we describe the methods. So in the same sequence as we list these things out in the method section. Certainly don't duplicate information in the text, tables, and figures, and do provide the statistical analysis that you do for all the information that you have. Your results section should not include any methods. And you'd say, this is so obvious. But every third, fourth paper that I come across that is submitted to our journal has a sentence or two which actually belongs elsewhere and not in the results section. Sometimes from the introduction, sometimes from the method section tends to creep into the results. This is often because we are not very focused when we write out our first drafts. We're still trying to flounder around and try and get some sense of what we want to do. Therefore, never ever submit your first draft for publication. We should not include data for which we do not have methods, and this too happens not infrequently. We should not start interpreting data in the results section because data interpretation is in the discussion section of a paper. And finally, if you have a desperate need to add a reference at the end of a sentence in the results section, then that particular section needs to move elsewhere. Results cannot have a reference because the results belong to you and can't refer to anybody else's results. If you wish to refer to anybody else's results, these need to go into the discussion section. There are only two exceptions to these kind of, to the references not appearing in the results. And those are two types of papers which are very specific. And they are systematic reviews and meta-analyses in which references would appear within the results section of the paper. Use appropriate statistics, provide exact p-values, but don't give us a number which says 0.00. It doesn't mean anything to either you nor me. I don't know what to make out of this. If you have something which appears like this, abbreviate it, round it off to give us a value something like less than 0.001. Or if you have an exact value, then do give us an exact value. Do not use multiple tests. For one piece of data, one statistical test is appropriate, and use statistical terms very carefully. There are a number of statistical terms. When used in science, those terms have a very specific meaning, while when used in the English language, these could have a little loose meaning. So words like random, significant, correlation have a very specific connotation in scientific literature. In contrast, in the English language, when we're speaking, when you're writing, these could be used a bit more loosely. So therefore, it's important that when we use statistical terms, we use these very carefully. I want to spend a little time talking to you about the parts of a table. You say, this fellow's now making us, school children again. We all know what a table is all about. But it's painful when we get table after table in a paper which doesn't have all its parts. And it becomes a back and forth between the authors and us trying to get the, uh, the the complete parts of a table. So every table must have a number, it must have a heading. Every row must have a row identifier. Every column must have a column heading. And when there are multiple cells in the body of the text, each one of these cells must have a piece of information. Don't leave a cell blank. If there is no value to put into the cell, tell us why there is no value. Is the value 0? Did you not record this value? Was this value not available to you? For whatever reason that may be. So please mention that. The stub is a word that, or a phrase that can be used as a common word or phrase for all the row identifiers. And finally, you have a footnote where any abbreviations that you use within the table, starting from the heading right down to the last cell, can be explained. Or if there is any statistical tests that have been used, they should be covered within the footnotes and explained there as well. If you use any symbols such as asterisks, daggers, a superscript A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3 within the table, then all those notations need to be explained in the footnote of a table. Generally, in written text, that means an original article written on submitted to a journal, prefer tables. Use figures only for illustrative purposes. So whenever you make a bar chart, a histogram, or a pie chart, ask yourself, should I make this, or is it better to provide this data in the form of a table? There is obviously a difference between written and oral communication. And if I were to present data at a conference, at a meeting, or say in a session such as this, I would definitely prefer a figure rather than a table. And that is something that one needs to remember whenever we go and present our data at different fora and in different methods of communication, using different methods of communication. I'm often asked, when should I make a table? It all depends on the number of items you have. If there are few variables in a sentence or two, I can explain all that I have within the text, that's fine. But I have many variables, then it's much better to make a table. Let's come to figures. Now, the multiple kinds of figures, there are figures which are typically called line drawings, and there are figures which in printing parlance are called halftones, essentially black and white pictures. So you've got pictures or you've got line drawings, and then you've got, of course, something which is in color. I've said we use them for illustration. We could use them to compare data as well. So if you have 2 different groups, 3 different groups, 5 different groups, we might want to compare the data and present them in a manner so that it's easy to understand and comprehend. And that too could be done using a figure. Look at this figure. Now, if I was doing a physical meeting with you, I would ask you, what do you think this is? And most often the answer that I get in workshops is that this is a barium swallow, or some people would say this is a thyroid scan, a nuclear scan. But if you actually look at it, without those labels, you can't make out that this is an inferior vena cavogram. This is actually submitted as a figure to us without the labeling, with the paper. And so this is what sometimes some of us end up doing. And therefore, this is something that one needs to be careful of. Whenever you use a picture, always label it so that somebody else can make out what's happening. The discussion section says, what does it all mean? In fact, Sir Bradford Hill, who gave us those 4 questions, said at one point in time, he seemed to think that it would be much better if we did not have a discussion section at all. You stop your paper at the end of the results. However, most people don't agree with him or did not agree with him, and we therefore still have a discussion section of a paper. And what we have to do in this section is to try and make people understand what does all this mean, all the methods, the results, and the introduction that we put together. So there are multiple ways in which we could write up our discussion section. Whenever I find something difficult to do, I try and break it up into parts, because then it becomes a smaller part that's easier to tackle. So here I've done a breakup of the discussion section of the paper. So if I was to break it up into 4 parts, the first part was what was found. And this could be a recapitulation of your salient results without the numerical data in the first paragraph of the introduction. So your summary of findings without the actual numbers, the quantities, but in broad picture terms, what did you find, what was important, is highlighted here. You could use a number or two if you wish to, but generally not too many numbers, and certainly no p-values and odds ratios and confidence intervals when you write out a summary of your findings. The second part of the discussion could be on what can be said of whatever you have found. So usually, if you have one question and you have one answer, there'd be 2 or maximum 3 points that you would want to make to get your point across to the reader. And these could comprise the first, the second, and potentially a third point. The third piece is the limitation sections, what one cannot say. So there is no perfect study yet, and therefore all studies have limitations, and we must therefore highlight what our studies' limitations are. This is extremely important to do, because this tells the reader that you've looked at your work in a very unbiased manner. You've looked at what you've got proactively and looked at all the pros, but you've also looked at all the cons. And this too you've done in a very conscious and determined manner. And finally, what you make of it, and that's the last paragraph or the conclusion and the recommendations. Some journals want you to have a sub-paragraph within the discussion section which says limitations, and this usually is part and parcel of the discussion. Other journals, and there are a few of them, who would want the limitations highlighted as a separate paragraph outside of the discussions. Other journals would not want you to write out the limitations at all as a subheading. They would just say write it out as a paragraph within the discussion section. So whatever the journal's requirement, you need to do that. And finally, you need to give them the last paragraph of the conclusions and the recommendations that you may have. For each limitation, discuss what is the limitation, what are the consequences of the limitation, what did you do to control or address the limitation, and how do you interpret the data in view of the limitation. Finally, your conclusion. And the former editor of the Annals of Internal Medicine said, after you've written up your paper, you must be able to answer 2 questions. So what and who cares? This gentleman has often been called the dean of medical editors. He's held in such high esteem. And so therefore he said, if you care, that's fine, but somebody else needs to care for this information that you've put together. And if you are able to answer these questions using information supported by your data, then you've done a good job. Generally avoid sweeping statements and conclusions. Confine your conclusions to the data that you have, rather than make statements which are based on data which is largely related to previously published work. Finally, you must have a take-home message. All of you have seen lots and lots of Bollywood movies, but you would remember a few of them. And you remember a few of them for a few weeks, you remember a few of them for a few months, but there are some classics which you remember for a lifetime. And that's what your paper should be. It should have a take-home message, which a person should remember for the longest possible period. More impactful your message, more the message is based on your data, the more likely the person is likely to remember this message for a long period of time. So that's something that's extremely important, and one needs to take care when one writes out a take-home message. There are other parts to a paper. I'm not going to discuss each one of these. There's a title, there's the abstract, keywords for some journals, references, authors, and acknowledgements, but I'll touch upon some of these. The most important of these is authorship. And authorship is something which is extremely controversial in the Indian context, partly because of the Medical Council of India's regulations requiring us to produce a certain number of papers to be eligible for promotion, and not allowing everybody to take, every author on the paper to take benefit of the work that they've done. They permit only a certain number of people to be given that credit. But authorship generally means that you take public responsibility to defend the paper for its content, both for its data and for its interpretation. Ghost authors are people who write papers but are not listed as authors. And this generally tends to happen in industry-sponsored papers. This provides incorrect credit and content attribution to a name. People become, people who've actually done the work don't get the credit. And that's something that shouldn't happen. And then there are gift authors, and a lot of us are aware of gift authorship, which happens in a lot of institutions and departments in India. And that is something that we should all try and discourage. People who do no work, you name them because you need to oblige them. And sometimes you name them because you feel, if I put down this person's name, if I put down Professor Bhatla's name, it's more likely that the journal editor who recognizes her will accept my paper, and therefore I put down her name as one of the authors. Again, incorrect credit. But more importantly, if the work is fraudulent, then there's nobody willing to take responsibility, and everybody backs out of taking responsibility. Remember the language that we use to write up a paper. Use simple words, use short sentences, and use short paragraphs. We are not writing prose here, and therefore what we want to do is to convey our thoughts easily and simply. None other than Einstein, who said, when you're out to describe the truth, leave the elegance to the tailor. Use language precisely. Use language that you're familiar with. Use language in a concise manner and have smooth and logical flow of thoughts. A good paper, I tell people, is something that I can read and understand lying in bed just before I go to sleep. I get up in the morning and I still remember what I read. A bad paper is something that I need to read sitting on a table with 5 colored highlighters, reading it again and again and again, and still not understanding it. So don't write up a paper which is not precise, familiar, concise, and smooth. A word or two about scientific misconduct. It's becoming a problem in a lot of places. Fabrication of data, falsification of data, and more commonly plagiarism. And all these are issues which can cause problems in people's careers, and we should be very careful about this. Does it occur? Yes, it does. There are numerous instances that have been documented worldwide. David Baltimore was the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. He didn't do anything wrong, but there were people in his lab who did something wrong. And he actually had to step down. He's also a Nobel laureate. He actually had to step down from the presidentship of the Rockefeller Foundation. Eugene Braunwald is somebody whose name everybody is familiar with. He's was editor for a number of editions of Principles of Internal Medicine by Harrison. And one of his students created a lot of fraudulent material and gave Eugene Braunwald a bad name. Happens in India too, and there are a number of instances well documented of people involved in fraudulent work. And we need to be very careful when we either gift author or accept gift authorship, that we are not associated with fraudulent material. Useful sites, websites where you can get more information. This is the website of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, also known as the Vancouver Group. Their URL is www.icmje.org, and they give you recommendations for the conduct, reporting, editing, and publication of scholarly work in medical journals. And this is a useful site to get a lot of information from if you are going to write up tons and tons of papers. Manuscript preparation is something that they talk about. This is another site where you get all the reporting guidelines. I said in the beginning I would show you this slide, and this is the URL for this, www.equatornetwork.org, and anything and everything is available on this site as far as reporting guidelines are concerned. If you're worried about publication ethics being an issue, or you encounter a problem with one of your students, one of your mentors, or yourself with a colleague, the Committee on Publication Ethics website, www.publicationethics.org, again gives you a lot of information on what to do when you encounter difficult or tricky problems related to ethical issues in publishing. So in summary, writing needs to be precise, it needs to be simple, it needs to be uniform. If we understand the IMRAD structure and answer the 4 questions and nothing else, we will always get a good paper to write in the end. There's no shortcut to improving a paper except to write, rewrite, and rewrite. And to make errors in writing is human, and as we continue to write, we will continue to improve and progress. Must remember that scientific misconduct is something that most institutions today have a zero tolerance towards. Thank you very much, and I'm willing to answer any questions that all of you may have.
Of course.
So thank you, Dr. Sahni. It was a wonderful lecture. Am I audible there?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll just take up some of the questions that have been put up in the chat box. And one of them was regarding the sample size. So they want to know which papers, do all kinds of papers, articles need to have a sample size? And if yes, how do we do that?
So most papers that you would, so most studies that you would do, it would be useful to have some idea of what is the sample that you wish to incorporate within this study. Most original research would have to have some sample size calculation, because the validity of your results is going to depend on whether you have an adequate sample size or not. But for some, say a case series, there can't be a sample size. If I have seen 20 patients and I wish to describe 20 patients of a particular kind, then obviously there can't be a sample size for that. Similarly, if I were to describe a rare disease, a disease which is seen very, very rarely, I'm very likely to encounter 2 or 3 or 4 patients. And if that's a small number of patients I have, and there is useful information, a message coming out of that paper, then I obviously won't have a sample size. But for even for observational studies, you can actually find out a sample size that would give you some validity of the results that you are obtaining, some assurance that you're not putting together too few or too many patients to get the information together. So try and get a sample size wherever you can and put it down into the paper, because that would give a sense to the reviewers as to what you've done, what you've attempted to do in relation to the number of patients that you would normally see. So yes, try and get a sample size wherever possible.
Thank you. And the other question is, should the title be always catchy to the readers, or a simple, straightforward is fine?
So in an original research paper, a title needs to be informative. It doesn't necessarily, it needs to catch the attention of the reader, but it doesn't necessarily need to be sensational. We are not writing a newspaper article. If we were writing a newspaper article, we would definitely have a sensational title. If I'm writing an editorial or an opinion piece or a viewpoint on something, then I might have a catchy title. I might have a sensational title. I might have an exclamatory title. I might have an interrogative title. But generally for original research, the title should be descriptive and informative. You could decide whether or not to put the results into the title. So you could say A treatment was better than B treatment, a randomized control trial. For this particular disease, a randomized control trial. Now, if there have been 5 previous randomized control trials, and what you're doing is in a subset which is very different from those 5 randomized control trials, and therefore these results are not earth-shaking, then it may not be very great to put in the results within the title. On the other hand, if I had something which is path-breaking as far as, say for example, COVID-19. So I find a treatment modality which is much better than what is available. I might actually say that X treatment is better than Y treatment, or X treatment as a panacea or something like that in the title itself. But generally, for an original article, informative, non-exclamatory, non-interrogative titles, descriptive titles.
Right. Thank you. Then there is someone has asked, what are the do's and don'ts in writing a case report?
So a case report, writing a case report is very similar to writing up an original article. So what you need is an introduction. Instead of the methods and the results, what you have is a description of the case. And finally, you have a discussion. So it's very similar to the IMRAD structure. And therefore, as far as the introduction and discussion is concerned, I must tell people, why did I do this? So why am I writing this case report? What is so great about this particular case report? So unless I tell people why it's important, what is the reason I'm writing this case report, it may not be a great idea to write up a case report. So, so the first do in a case report is to tell people, why are you writing this case report? The second thing is highlight things that are different and unique in your particular case compared to other cases that have been reported in the world literature. It's very unlikely you would come across the first ever case to be described. Yes, there was the first ever case of HIV. There was the first ever case of Ebola. There was the first ever case of COVID-19, but these are few and far between. For most of us who would want to write a case report, there'd be something unique in that case report. That particular patient behaved differently from patients who had the same disease and had previously been reported. And that is what we wish to highlight. That is why we are writing the report. And therefore, in the description of the case, we must ensure that there's enough information to say that this uniqueness was actually present. So that is something that you need to get across to people. Unless you do that, a Me Too case report, I did one, you did one, he did one, she did one, that's not of much sense. So that's why fewer and fewer journals today take case reports, because a lot of them are repetitive. They don't say anything different, and therefore you need to say something that is different. If you can't say something different, please don't write a case report. I hope this answers the question. I know it's not a very positive answer, but I'm sorry, case reports unfortunately are something that's easy to do. Everybody thinks they're easy to do. They're not. Unfortunately, they're extremely difficult things to write.
So then many people are asking the order of the authorship.
Okay.
What should be the order of the authorship in international and national journals? Is it different or it's the same? So
authorship remains same, irrespective of whether you're publishing in A, B, or C journal. The problem is the Medical Council of India has certain recommendations, and it says that it would, I believe they now include the first 3 authors, and the corresponding author can take credit of the paper for their own promotion. So that means a total of 4 people. So if there are 10 people on a paper, everybody wants to be either in the first 3 or a corresponding author. Now, ideally, the person who has done the maximum amount of work should be the first author. So if the paper is based on the work of a thesis of a student, the student should be the first author. The guide could be the second. A co-guide could be the third. I prefer to be the last, because the last author is the most senior author. I obviously am in a little privileged position that I am towards the fag end of my career, so it doesn't matter how many more papers I get or I don't get. Also, I work at an institution where the MCI regulations don't work. We are not covered by the MCI regulations at the Institute of Medical Sciences, and that's another advantage. So some of you may say you can sit on your high horse and say these things. For us, the reality is different. But to me, the student needs to be the first author if it is the thesis of the student from where the work is coming. But if that is not so, then the person who has done the most amount of work, the most amount of donkey work, the leg work, the actual data collection, the actual data analysis, the writing of the first draft, the junior resident, the senior resident who's done the maximum amount of work. Those are the people who should be amongst the first few authors on the paper. And generally, if we don't need authorship for our promotions, then we could dispense with that and let others take on the authorship. Generally, people who've done more work in the beginning of the paper, people who've done less work and have been more philosophical in their approach, in the sense given you ideas, suggested minor modifications, or even major modifications for that matter, they could be at the end of the paper. The corresponding author, as far as journal editors are concerned, are people whom they can communicate with. They're people with whom they can send a paper to and expect a response. That's all. Yeah. So as far as journal editors are concerned, corresponding authors are only that much, corresponders, nothing else. But institutions, promotion committees pay a little weightage, give a little weightage to that. And therefore they say that a corresponding author is somebody who's more important. So again, somebody who's middle level, who can actually do the answering, the corresponding with the editor and has done some work, could become a possible corresponding author. If you look at the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors website, they give you 4 criteria for anybody to become an author. So anybody who is an author on a paper should ideally fulfill those 4 criteria.
Okay, sir, then there was one question regarding how to choose the journal in which the paper should go.
Okay, so I do a talk which is a 20-minute talk on how to choose a journal. So I don't have 20 minutes, but let me very briefly tell you how to choose a journal. So you choose a journal depending upon whom you want to should read your paper. So if I am an obstetrician gynecologist and I am working in fetal medicine, and I know that if I send this to the National Medical Journal of India, which is a general medical journal, there'll be hardly anybody who will be interested in reading it. I won't send my paper to the National Medical Journal of India. I would send it to a journal called the Journal of Fetal Medicine or something like that, because that's my focus. On the other hand, if I was working on anemia in pregnancy, it's a broader area. I would then try and go to a journal which is read by obstetricians. And if I was looking at anemia in women, I would probably go to a general medical journal, because this is for a much wider audience. So depending upon the audience, you choose the journal. You also choose the journal which doesn't ask you for too much money. So publication fee is something that is now sometimes needed to be paid. So if I was to go to a journal which was going to charge me $2,000 and I didn't have the means to pay up those $2,000, then I wouldn't go to that journal. I would much rather go to a journal which may take longer to publish my paper, but may even reject my paper, but is willing to go ahead and publish my paper without taking any publication fee. A journal could ask me to write a paper in 1,500 words. The data that I have cannot be fitted in less than 3,000 words. But that's, if you feel that that's the case, then you need to go and find a journal which will accept a longish paper. Don't go to a journal which has those kind of editorial requirements. So look at editorial requirements, look at the audience that you wish to address, look at the need or otherwise of a publication fee, and then decide which journal you wish to go to.
Thank you, sir. I think you have answered most of the questions very nicely. And there was one about how to calculate the sample size, but I'm sure that cannot be done like this. Maybe we have some statistical this thing.
Yeah, you will have to get somebody else to sit down with you,
Yeah.
or I could sit down with you, set another date and time, and tell you how to do it.
Yeah, somebody has asked, is there any provision of two principal authors in one article? I don't think so, but I mean,
Yes, you can,
few
but it's an
exceptional,
exception. It's not the
yeah,
rule. So
yeah,
if there are two people who have done an equal amount of work, then you could write to the editor of the journal and say, uh, the first two names are people who have contributed equally. I have seen journals which have allowed even three first authors by saying the first three have contributed equally, but you must be able to justify and write down as to what is the work that each one of them has done and why you think that the work was equal as far as both of them are concerned. We have occasionally allowed two people to be the first authors of a paper. We generally don't allow two corresponding authors, but two first authors, yes.
Thank you, sir. I think all the questions are done. And, you know, the patience with which you have answered, I must appreciate that a lot. And we have all gathered a lot of knowledge from your lecture. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me to talk. I'm very passionate about this subject, and therefore I have lots and lots of patience as far as answering questions is concerned on this topic. Thank you so much. Thank you for asking me to talk.
Dr. Sani, if I could just ask one question, because we have a lot of
Sure.
students as well. If you could just tell us about impact factor of the journals, I think that would be very helpful to all of us.
Yeah, okay. So as far as impact factors, there are certain metrics, certain means of measuring the quality of a journal. And one of those is an impact factor. There are lots of other measures also, but one of those is impact factor. And the impact factor is actually, it was devised by a person by the name of Eugene Garfield. He devised it for librarians who had a budget to decide which journals to subscribe to and which journals to not subscribe to. So it was a quality metric, but it was a quality metric for librarians, not actually to assess the science behind it. So the impact factor is calculated by the number of citations that articles published in the previous 2 years receive, articles published in a journal in the previous 2 years receive. And that's what is the impact factor, determined by the number of citations that articles published in the previous 2 years have received. Now, the impact factor is dependent upon a number of things. I, as a journal editor, could publish one controversial paper, and therefore my impact factor could climb up in a particular year. I could also use wrong means to try and increase my impact factor. In fact, I know of a journal which was actually delisted from the impact factor list because the journal editors would write to each author and say, you must quote 5 papers from our journal. And that would falsely increase the impact factor of a journal. But essentially what the impact factor does is give you some kind of a quality metric based on the number of citations the papers published in that journal have received. Now, just because the journal has a high impact factor doesn't mean every paper published in that journal has actually received a high number of citations. That's the average. So therefore, there could be multiple papers which have actually received not a single citation, but have been published in that journal with a high impact factor. And there are only a few papers which have received a large number of citations, which have led to the impact factor being very high. So it's very important to not only understand the impact factor, but also understand that there are flaws within the impact factor. More and more people amongst journal editors are now realizing that the impact factor is not the only way to assess the quality of journals. Unfortunately, institutions, selection committees, promotion committees are still not aware of these drawbacks of the impact factor and continue to use them very frequently. So if given a choice, I would much rather not look at the impact factor. But come June, July, every editor is looking at the impact factor of his or her own journal. I hope that helps. If you have anything specific that you wish me to answer related to the impact factor, I'm happy to clarify further.
That's fine, sir. That was what we wanted to hear.
I see one more question regarding what is a letter to editor, what it includes and why we need to do it.
Okay. So a letter to editor is for multiple things, multiple ways in which you can use the letter to editor. One is to respond to something that's published already in that journal. And you write a letter to the editor and support, criticize, question what has been written in that particular article. The letter to editor could also be a viewpoint. You might write something which you feel very strongly about, especially sometimes, within specialities and specialty journals, there are regulations that may be framed. For example, the National Board of Examination has recently come up with 2-year diploma courses. And some of you may feel very strongly about it. And you don't have a place where you want to voice your opposition to it. You might write a letter to an editor of a journal and request them to publish that. And this would be a means, a forum of making people aware within your own community, scientific community, of the pros and cons of having such courses or such regulations. So these are the two major reasons to write to editor. Sometimes if you write something which you feel is worth a brief report, the editor looks at it and feels that this could be shortened to a very small correspondence with or a letter to the editor and a message be provided. Editors of journals may actually change the format a bit and publish it as a letter to the editor. Nature, of course, publishes research letters. So they have a column which they call research letters, and there are a number of other journals also which publish research letters. They don't call them brief communications, or they have brief communications as well as research letters, and the research letters are even shorter than a brief communication. And as I said, the DNA paper was actually a very, very brief research letter, which just described the structure of the DNA. Something that was very profound, impacted us in a major way, but was published as a research letter. So different formats, but primarily for two things: to raise a question about something that's already published, ask a question, raise a doubt, query an author. All that can happen to a letter to editor of a published article, or if you wish to make a point of view well known to your own scientific community.
Right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. I think that was a wonderful lecture, and we have lots of positive feedback on the chat. And I think all of us have enjoyed, and we've learned a lot.
Thank you, sir. Am I on?
Yeah, Nisha, you wanted to say something?
No, actually my connection went, so I was not hearing. It's fine. Thank you.
So I think this was the last of our research methodology lecture series, and I think it was a wonderful ending to the lecture series as well. A few students have asked for your email address. So if you're happy with it, we can share it with them.
Sure, no problem.
That's great. Thank you so much. And we will be putting up the recording of this as well on the website. If that is okay with you, we shall do that. So that
sure, most welcome.
Thank you so much again. And as I said, this would be the last lecture in the research methodology series. From next Saturday, we will be going on to the clinical practice lecture series, and our first talk will be on global strategies for cervical cancer elimination, and this will be by Dr. Shankar Narayanan. So looking forward to seeing you, seeing all of you next Saturday. Thank you all, and have a very good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Thank you.